This is Software Meets Business, a podcast sponsored by Head Channel.
Welcome to another episode of Software Meets Business. With me today, I have Jonathan Healey, a Managing Director, IDHL Web Division. Hi, Jonathan.
Good afternoon, Rich. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. So I think really getting started, the title of this one is Scaling Teams, Scoring Wins, the Realities of Global Development Management. So I was thinking about this, and I guess where we should start is really about the evolution of outsourcing. We start there. Does that work?
Yeah, that sounds good for me. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, right? Software's been happening for decades and decades. Certainly in terms of kind of my career, my observation would be that it's got a lot easier from a technical standpoint. I think, early 2000s, slow internet, connectivity to developing countries, not great. Telecoms, we didn't have Teams, we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have Google Meet, we didn't have any of these things that kind of facilitate that face-to-face conversation. So it was all conference calls and people clustered around telephones. So just overall, the comms has become much, much easier. And, the World Wide Web, the internet as such, has kind of really delivered on that promise, I guess, of connecting people around the world for business.
Certainly the tooling's got better, hasn't it?
Oh, 100%. And it's not just the tooling. I think it's the frameworks, the platforms, the ecosystems. I think going back to, early days, early 2000s of trying to find, a guy somewhere who could do a thing and sort of scouring the planet and really, really struggling. There are whole platforms and businesses set up today to facilitate this, vast industries in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe and South America that are all geared around providing this kind of service to agencies, other software builders and direct-to-end clients. So that's changed a lot and probably more so in the last 10 years.
So what was it like in those early 2000s? Because you started your career in 1999, which...
Yes, yeah, trying to fix the problems of the Y2K bug that never quite emerged.
But you did a great job.
Well, it was all down to me. It never happened in the end. I do remember one instance of trying to kind of build an online mail solution. This is, long before something like Gmail existed. And, the only people we knew that were doing this were Hotmail, if you've been around long enough to remember Microsoft's Hotmail product.
Sadly, I do.
Which is not what it sounds like at all. And so we spoke to Microsoft and said, look, we want to run a mail system for 400,000 mailboxes. How do we do it? And they said, you can't do it. And we said, but you run Hotmail. And they were, oh, yeah, but that's our secret source. We scoured the internet. I can't remember where we found, but we found a chap in Russia who said, yeah, I can do that for you. And genuinely, for about £1,000, he built us this thing that ultimately scaled to around 2 million active mailboxes. And not only that, he said he would support it for free forever, which was an amazing deal and absolutely fun. I don't think there are deals like that to be had anymore. But maybe back in that time, a pound bought a lot more rubles perhaps than it, well, maybe more or less than it does today. But that was kind of maybe the first profound kind of experience of that. And then I've probably been on the receiving end of that as well, working for, I worked for a large, providing development services for a large telecoms outfit based in Australia at the time, which was the other side of the world and very, very challenging. But perhaps some anecdotes from that later on in the discussion today.
Yeah. Okay. So you started off with, and that was your first experience with the Russian guy who supported it forever. So is he still supporting that, or is there something else?
Well, I've subsequently moved on from that employment,
okay.
And I think their products and services have changed, and I don't think what he built actually exists as a public offering anymore. So I think he's finally off the hook.
Oh, finally.
Probably for a few years, to his tremendous relief, I imagine.
Some guy in Russia is still supporting this platform. Okay, so as you started sort of your journey with the offshoring part, so that was a nice story about finding the Russian guy, right? So that was a nice. But were there any early stories that were a bit more
Yeah, I think as you start to do this, there's always been that buzz about, right, you can get some really cheap resource in other parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia. And I think you soon start to learn that that's not necessarily true, as in the day rate might be extremely attractive, but there are all sorts of nuances around culture, around time zones, around uh, similar expectations, around even just down to, I think, everyone's definition of what a developer, a senior developer, a junior developer looks like. So you might have a situation where you think that you're contracting with a senior developer, but my definition of senior developer is a slightly different level than the one I'm being provided with. And of course, that leads to various challenges and so on and so forth. So there's been a lot of trial and error over the years. And in terms of every time I think we've tried to do something along these lines, you soon start to learn that there is another pitfall that you need to overcome.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. When you say that you've got that difference, is it a bit like a Ryanair flight? So the headline price is really good, but then you start adding all the things on that you actually need, and then it becomes some crazy price that you may have well gone with a different airline.
Yeah, I think completely. It's less about sort of add-on and hidden fees here. I think it's more about understanding what the intangible costs of employing somebody are. And if you're employing somebody boots on the ground in a physical office in the UK, you understand that there's a tax on doing that. There's the floor space that you have to rent for them. There's the equipment that you have to provide for them, and you factor that into your calculations. Those things still kind of exist when you're outsourcing. They just exist in different ways. So, for example, do I now need to hire a project manager, either in the UK or boots on the ground in a foreign location in order to manage the output over there? Do I need to send some proper equipment into a foreign location? Do I need to invest more time in training and upskilling staff that I wouldn't normally expect to do for a contractor? So all of these things can very quickly add up. And then, of course, there's just simply the communication gap, language gap, potentially between people. It means things take longer to explain. There's a higher chance that they don't come back right the first time around. And so all of that essentially adds an extra cost to what you're doing.
So a lot of people I talk to, they have had an idea for an app, and they're very excited about it, and rightly so, because usually they've had a really good idea. They know the space, and they want to build it, and they are quite cost sensitive, and so the headline rates of offshore development teams considerably appeals to them, and they don't understand the difference between what they could end up with an offshore developer because of all the other things, and obviously the higher rates that you have for nearshore and onshore. So is there anything that you could say to those people who are a little bit naive? How do they not be naive when they are naive? Is there a solution to that?
I think it's recognizing that developers are not bums on seats. If I'm buying, I don't know, a piece of machinery, there are certain kind of performance factors that are easily measured, easily quantified, easily understood. And that's not necessarily the case when it comes to developers. And I think the skill in development has got far more to do with the ability to join all the bits together than to churn out code. So in terms of the ability to churn out code, I would say the difference between somebody based in the UK and somebody based in Southeast Asia or South America or far afield like that is not much different. But taking that code that's being churned out and translating it into something useful, that's a slightly different skill. And
Absolutely.
It requires an ecosystem around it to ensure that that happens to a certain degree of quality that is acceptable. And I think very often for somebody who's maybe not used to working with developers, maybe perhaps straying into this for the first time, there is a tendency of developers to do exactly what you ask them to do, which is, of course, how they're trained and how they think. But of course, if you don't know how to ask them what to do, the thing that they produce may misalign with your expectations, and it may misalign significantly. So there is a skill in a developer or a development organization in being able to tease out what the correct thing is to produce, rather than just off the back of a simple brief.
Yeah, absolutely. And in today's crazy world, there is enough ways to just generate code.
Of course,
you need some more thinking around that generally. Okay. Are there any anecdotes of you offshoring in the early days where it went really, really wrong?
We've had a couple of odd experiences.
The developer that didn't exist, perhaps?
Well, it's sort of. I mean, we some years ago we were working with we were short on resource. We needed some extra hands. We identified a guy in the Philippines who would work for us, and actually he was fantastic. Did really good work, worked really well with our team. First few projects went absolutely brilliantly. And I don't know if you know this, but in the Philippines, they often have quite extreme weather.
Yes, I've heard
We
this.
didn't know this, but the very first time they had a typhoon, we just lost all contact with this chap for 2 weeks. Completely off the radar, completely let us down. We didn't know whether he was working. I don't know whether he could work or not, but suddenly we were stuck in a bind. And so we unfortunately ended our relationship on that basis, just simply due to the reliability of the connectivity due to severe weather. We've had another experience, which was perhaps even more frustrating. Again, reaching out to an outfit based in Southeast Asia. I think this one was in Cambodia. Seemed to have a good reputation. I think it may even have been referred to us by a trusted party. So we started working with this outfit, looking for some great outsourced developers. We'd learned some of our lessons by that time. Is that interview the people, make sure that you've got the right people that are going to work for your project. So we interviewed a few people. We selected a guy that looked like he would really suit our criteria. He started working with us. It went excellently. Great work. And after about 2 weeks, the quality really, really dropped off.
Right.
And so this was a little bit surprising. We queried it. They gave us a little bit of a refund. But the quality continued to persist badly. We tried to get this chap onto a telephone call to work through some of the issues. And afterwards, some of our dev leads came off and said, "We don't think that's the same guy." And so you're stuck with a situation where you think, okay, is there a certain sort of very great developer that gets churned out for all the interviews, and then once you're kind of hooked into the equation, you're suddenly swapped out for the B team? And of course, because it's remote, and maybe there's a language barrier and some accents involved, they're sort of hoping that maybe you won't notice. We did in this instance. Either the guy was having a bad month, or it was a different person entirely. But of course, again, you end that relationship and you look for alternative solutions.
Interesting stuff. So over that time, then you've obviously done a lot of work with outsourced companies. Have you got to a point where you've had numbers of teams all working together from different outsourcers?
So the short answer is more individuals working with outsourcers. So I think over the years we've established sort of a trusted network of people that we can work with regularly. The vast majority of those are actually full-time employees who've subsequently chosen to go back to their country of origin, etc. And we've enjoyed working with them, and they've enjoyed working with us. But you need some kind of a trusted kind of third party to facilitate the working relationship. And so, strictly speaking, it is an outsourced arrangement. Although very often the way that we work, it treats those individuals more like they were full-time employees in the business. And that's something that's really worked for us. We have at times when resource has been harder, looked to establish kind of a more permanent base in different parts. We've looked to Southeast Asia a couple of times. That's never worked for us. I do know people that it works very, very well for, but we found some of the time zone challenges a real issue for us. And even though many of those companies are prepared to work into their evenings and late at night, many of them will start their day at midday and work through to sort of 10 p.m., which can help. It's always just been too much, too far to do that. We did strike up a relationship with an operation that we helped to establish in the Middle East a few years ago that went pretty well. It was hard work. We had to get boots on the ground, really, in order to do that. It was done on the back of existing relationships that we had. So there was a degree of kind of trust and knowledge of the people that we were engaging with. We treated it very much like almost a sort of a full-time employment type of scenario, although through a third party. And then over time, as we were able to recruit locally in the UK, we were able to slowly wind down that operation. Although one or two of the individuals from that operation subsequently moved into Europe, and we've been able to work with them more easily as sort of standalone freelancers, which has been quite nice to see that that relationship continuing.
Let me just interrupt this podcast for a few seconds. I just wanted to let you know about our wonderful sponsor, Headchannel. Headchannel builds software engineering teams, and they've been building software for clients since 2003. They have a very simple engagement model. Either they develop and run it, or they build it and you run it. They could also help with finding a fractional CTO if you need that support. You can find them at headchannel.co.uk. And now back to the podcast.
Yeah. And so talk to us about the human side of it.
Yeah, so I think my first realization on this, I talked about the Australian experience that I had where I was the outsourced operation for a large telecoms company. I had a team around me and maybe 7 or 8 developers working for me at the time. This was based in South Africa back in the early 2000s. And I think one of the things that really sort of struck us was how difficult our early morning calls could be. As in, we were all clustered around a telephone on a call to Australia, which is a long way away. It's 8 o'clock in the morning for us. It's 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening for them in Sydney. And often the calls became quite unreasonable. And there was clearly kind of a disconnect happening over there. I think the work that we produced was very good. It went down very well. We had a long-term relationship with them. And actually, off the back of an initial project, we sent a project manager out to Australia to get, again, closer to the end customer. And so we rented an apartment for them in Sydney, and they were there for three months, I think it was. And when they came back, the revelation about the morning calls suddenly became apparent is that for them, this was right at the end of their day. And often they would finish work and think, we've got a call in an hour's time. Why don't we nip down to the pub? And so they would nip down to the pub for a few and come back and do the call with us. And of course, this explained perhaps the up and down of the calls that you're getting. Now, that's probably a cultural difference. I don't know if we would do that in the UK, but there's also a time of day difference and a time zone difference, which really made it apparent that even English speaking, very kind of Eurocentric, maybe even Anglo-centric customers could behave in quite a different way than we would perhaps expect.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's very interesting. So, what do you think about bringing teams, all these remote people, and trying to integrate them together and make them work, or encourage them to work in a much more efficient and effective way? You got any advice and tips around that?
Yeah, I think I mean, you're probably talking about things like aligning your technical stack and project management methodology and how do you sort of get that buy-in from various people. It takes a lot of hard work, and we talked earlier about some of the sort of the taxes or the on costs or the intangible costs of outsourcing. These are some of those areas that you have to invest in to make it work. I think one piece of advice I would have is you've got to know where you stand in those things. I think that there is a difference between outsourcing development and outsourcing resource. So if I'm using a resource from a third-party provider, I'm bringing them into my team. I expect them to operate like my team operates, using the tech stack that we use, using the project management methodology that we use. I expect them to join our daily stand-ups. I expect them to be and to act and behave like my team does. If I'm outsourcing the development, I think that should be left to the provider to decide how that fits together. And I think for me, it's where you mix and match the two that some of the challenges can really come into the equation. And that's where probably both sides have to be really lean and agile in how they think about these things and how they're prepared to work. So my experience has been most outsourced resource specialists will adapt to your tech stack. Of course, that means you've got to have a tech stack in the first place and know how to operate it and know what you want, or you're going to leave them asking you lots and lots of questions. And if you're outsourcing development, that team's likely to have a preferred way of working. And certainly from my experience, where we've got customers outsourcing development requirements to us at IDHL, we have an entire ecosystem built around our development stack. And we would say a huge amount of the value that we bring is in the ecosystem around the development more than in the development itself. And so when you start tampering with that ecosystem and start putting requirements on us, which may look like very reasonable requirements, if they're changing the way that we typically operate, you're potentially eroding the value that you've got in working with us in the first place. So that's, I think the short answer is it can be really, really hard. But know where you stand.
Yeah, be very clear about the relationship that you want to have, whether that's a resource and they're coming on board and you're going to provide everything, or whether it's the other way. I always think of it a bit like if you've ever had any, building work done, that's the old classic, isn't it? Because you can hire a builder, and there's different types of builders, and you can get one that will project manage everything and make sure it's all done and you don't have any questions. Or you get the kind of typical type of builder, which is they have their team come in, they leave because they're on another job, which is a classic. And then you spend half the day telling people where electric sockets are going and, all the other stuff, where the pipe work should go, So I think it's a very similar.
The analogies between the construction industry and software development are absolutely endless. I think that they're very, very closely aligned. And we've been building buildings since the pyramids and before, and we still can't get something to come in and on time and on budget. So maybe there's just something in human nature around these types of projects and how they fit together.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it goes right, how does it feel?
Oh, I mean, first of all, there's probably a sigh of relief. I think, certainly from my perspective, and maybe over the last 10 years or so, any reason to outsource is driven by a requirement for resource. And certainly speaking from an agency perspective, I would much, much rather have that resource in my team. And there is always that risk of working with somebody that is new. So when it goes right, and it can and does go right, it feels great. Because suddenly you've solved a problem that you weren't able to solve before just on your own. And I would say that's maybe the biggest plus point of the type of kind of, I guess, modern working relationship that we have with an ability to outsource and many, many frameworks and platforms and individuals available is when you're able to identify the right people, it goes very, very well. And so, we have a trusted roster of people that we work with from time to time that help to provide a degree of kind of overflow capability that really means that we can be flexible with our clients' needs and responsiveness and everything that sort of goes around that. You'll know from your world that the peaks and troughs that an agency goes through are one of the most challenging things to manage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And having a means to manage that is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. How do you know they're the right people, though?
Well, you've got to try them out. You've got to test them out.
Okay.
And sometimes when we are trying somebody new, and it happens very rarely these days, there is a degree of kind of contingency planning that we have to put in place. We have to go into it just assuming it's going to go horribly wrong, because what we don't want is for a customer to be suffering on the end of what could be our experiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, if you put that contingency plan in place and it goes right, then you're winning double, because your expectations are being exceeded. You've found somebody that you know and you can trust and you can work with. And of course, you've got a happy customer on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just go back a bit and take a big view across your whole entire career, if we can, Jonathan. Does that sound quite kind of epic? So obviously you started off as a developer. Is that
near as
a developer? So you've got a bit of technical background, and now obviously you're an MD. What's the tips if anyone else wants to go on that journey?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I never set out to become an MD. I'm not sure what I set out to do. I said I started life in that Y2K crisis, which wasn't really a crisis. I installed some servers for some banks. It went well. The company asked me to build their website because I'd done some programming in my spare time at some point. And all of a sudden I was a software developer, and it was, the year 2000 and off we go. And, suddenly I was 27 years old and I was running a fairly large development team, which I'm not sure would happen in today's market and economy. And so I'm probably lucky to have been present at a certain point in time when a certain industry was just getting up and getting going. That being said, I think that it is quite rare for developers to make the transition to executive leadership. And I've been sort of scratching my brain thinking, okay, well, what are some of the things that could be the differentiator? And my personal view is that many developers, first of all, they get into programming or development because they love to problem solve. It's not the same for everybody, but for many of them, that sort of thrill of creating a solution to a problem that you've kind of invented is probably the right word. Gives a certain buzz and a certain thrill. And so fundamentally, developers are problem solvers. But if you're working purely at the technical implementation level of solving a problem, I think that you are limiting yourself and your ability. And I think that it is quite rare to find developers who are prepared to use the exact same skills they use day to day to a wider set of problems. So whether that's the commercial problems, the time and the client constraints, whether that's infrastructure constraints, whether that's interpersonal factors, once you can start to factor some of those things into the problem solving scenario and make it more than just a technical problem that you're solving, I think that gives a superpower to people. And it's always baffled me that many developers don't seem to want to or be prepared to make that leap, because to me, I think that's surely far more interesting, taking together all the factors to solve a problem rather than just the technical solution factors, and feels far more rewarding. So that would be my advice, is to think wider than just the technical piece. You're a problem solver. Businesses need problem solvers, but not every problem is solved by writing a few clever lines of code.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge for that is that once you get out of the technology, you get into strange, weird things, which is generally people. and that's where the problems are strange to solve.
And less black and white.
Yeah.
And perhaps no correct answers.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think if you can, and maybe that's a really good point actually, is that if you can learn to live in a world of grey and navigate that and accept that there are no wrong answers and no right answers, just better answers and worse answers. But I think, again, if you're, if you perhaps very mathematically driven and want every equation to have a very clear answer, because that's how you're made up as a person, that world can be quite difficult to embrace.
Yeah. And similarly, the other way around, if you're a very people person, it would drive you mad, wouldn't it? having
And,
equations.
and I guess, unfortunately or fortunately, many of the people who have those great ideas for that app that they want to outsource are very much on the people end of that spectrum. Entrepreneurial, love to live in the grey areas, constantly innovating, constantly changing, constantly moving around from place to place. And so if you can kind of bring those two, the very technical and the very non-technical together, that's definitely the recipe for success.
Absolutely. Execution, ideas, execution together. Absolutely. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add basically on the future? I mean, where's it going for you? What's happening?
I mean, in terms of my future or in terms of the future of outsourcing, and probably easier to comment on the future of outsourcing.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I've become very aware of in the last few years is kind of the changing regulatory framework that we live in. And things like the COVID pandemic suddenly sent people to remote working, which is amazing. And suddenly it begs the question, well, if I'm working remotely for my employer in the UK, why can't I work for that employer anywhere in the world? And I think many, certainly agencies and sort of development organizations have allowed that and allowed their workforces to be disparate. It creates a degree of kind of tax and compliance risk for any employer doing that. So that's a real challenge. That's a challenge to navigate with teams and with staff. We have things like the IR35 framework that came in and then didn't come in and then came in and didn't come in. And I'm not entirely sure where we stand on that, but those regulations, which really I would wholeheartedly support to prevent essentially what's legal tax avoidance, do make it difficult both for individuals and companies to operate effectively with perhaps a network of freelancers or outsourced providers. And then I think also within that, you've got development fundamentally involves working with data. And all of the kind of controls and regulations around data, we're obviously very familiar with GDPR and UK GDPR in this country. Other countries all are adopting their flavors of that wherever they may be. And that makes the portability of data and therefore the portability of development resource more technically challenging. And we certainly see that in what our customers are demanding and what they want to see, and they want to have a degree of input and control into how we are working with their data. And so, you've got to keep on investing in systems to ensure that you are protecting and looking after that data, which is, I think we would all agree, a very, very good thing, but it doesn't make it an easy thing from a technical point of view.
No, it makes things more costly.
And makes things more costly, of course.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to bear the cost for that, and that's either going to be the employee, the client, or the agency. So a big challenge, and I can only see a scenario where there is more and more regulatory frameworks in place, and with AI regulations sort of starting to become talked about and brought into play, that adds another layer of potential complexity on top of all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But luckily, no impact from tariffs yet.
Well,
no direct.
No, but I mean, perhaps on many of our customers who have to navigate all of this, there is potential impact in terms of any software that is handling tax and payments, which must be an absolute nightmare to manage at the moment. And thankfully, so far, anything around these tariffs and tariff wars has all been goods related rather than services related. So I think for those of us who work in the services industry, and particularly given how the UK is such a services-driven economy, it's important that we keep one ear to the ground on that. And let's, hope, fingers crossed, that nothing too drastic happens in that regard.
I have everything crossed. On that point, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expert knowledge around offshoring and all the things that sit around that. It's been great. Thank you so much.
That's an absolute pleasure, Rich. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Software Meets Business, the podcast sponsored by Head Channel. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on your preferred platform.